FanScape, a fan fiction podcast, presents Blood and Venom Part 2, Shattered Reality. Chapter 13, Made to Suffer.
It's been 4 days since the border of Oakside National Park went up in flames, and ongoing investigations have finally shed some light on the situation. Sources say the fire raged for hours before local firefighters were able to arrive at the scene. This was partly due to the poor condition of the road leading up the mountainside, which had been overtaken by rock slides and vegetation due to its many years of abandonment. Aerial firefighting also proved to be largely ineffective due to severe technical malfunctions that manifested in aircraft attempting to approach the site of the blaze, and pilots were instructed to return to the ground out of fear for their safety. It is currently unknown what was responsible for the interference, but some theorize that an old radio station at the top of the mountain range may have been responsible. The station has become something of an urban legend in the surrounding area because of the bizarre signals that it occasionally broadcasts, and investigators have suggested that those very signals could have been what was hindering emergency aircraft. These broadcasts have long been a subject of debate due to their cryptic nature, and the fact that the derelict station shouldn't even be capable of broadcasting anything has left many scratching their heads over the years. Many have looked into this mystery before with inconclusive results, but local authorities have now opened an official investigation into the matter after discovering the threat posed to emergency responders. Oddly enough, both the radio station and its tower were left untouched by the forest fire, so Oakside residents will still be able to see that familiar red glow above the mountains for the foreseeable future. Despite the complications in combating the inferno, luck proved to be on Mother Nature's side. The fire stayed relatively contained with minimal human intervention and burned itself out after only a few hours, despite having the potential to spread much further and cause far more damage. The origin of the blaze is still undetermined, but a recent death may provide clues as to its source. Forensic testing has identified the body found in the aforementioned ECKVA station as longtime Oakside resident and mechanic Carl Ross. Authorities had been attempting to locate Mr. Ross for several days prior to the discovery of his body after an explosion caused by a gas leak leveled his house. Many of the details regarding his death have been kept private out of respect for the family, but materials found at the scene have led law enforcement to believe that Ross's deteriorating mental state had led him to take his own life. It's rumored that the apparent suicide may have been connected to the forest fire in some way, but nothing is confirmed as of yet. It isn't known what brought the victim to the radio station before his untimely death, as employment records show no prior affiliation with ECKVA Network or the previous owners of the building, Clear Lake Communications. He is survived by his parents, Shane and Vanessa Ross, who refused to comment.
Oh, come on, you piece of...
A woman grumbled, fiddling with the knob on her stereo until she could once again hear something other than radio static.
And in a matter that might be related, police are still attempting to locate 23-year-old Caitlin Milens, who was reported missing on the morning of September 14th when her elderly neighbor Dale Mulligan discovered her home in shambles. Mr. Mulligan is the owner of a small farm bordering Miss Milens' property and had been visiting to discuss the recovery of several of his hay bales after they'd been blown across the property line by the recent storm. It wasn't long before Dale realized something was wrong and contacted the police, who quickly launched an investigation into the young woman's disappearance. Mr. Mulligan was quickly ruled out as a suspect and has described Caitlin as a quiet and reserved but kind woman. Also missing is 26-year-old Lauren Jones, whose vehicle was found abandoned at the base of Milens' driveway. According to business reports, Jones had been visiting from the United States to act as a realtor for Miss Milens, who'd been in the final stages of selling her house. Information gathered by the authorities has revealed that Jones and Milens were childhood friends and had grown up together along with the late Carl Ross, whose Jeep was also discovered abandoned in Caitlin's driveway. It is unknown what role Miss Jones and Miss Milens had to play in Mr. Ross's fate, if any, but both women are wanted for questioning. All evidence points to the three being on good terms with one another, although the mental health of Miss Milens has been called into question due to certain materials found within her home. Foul play isn't suspected, but it hasn't been ruled out either. Local law enforcement has asked for anybody with information on either of these women to come forward immediately. Even the smallest detail could aid in this investigation. That's all the information we currently have on the situation. Back to you, Jill.
Thank you, Mike. Oakside is rarely anything but calm and quiet, but sadly our little town isn't a stranger to things like untimely deaths, missing people, or suspicious fires. One might remember a long line of tragedies involving the Matheson family.
The radio was abruptly silenced when the middle-aged woman behind the wheel hit the power button, not wanting to hear another word. She'd recounted her life's misfortunes enough without listening to yet another reporter narrate Oakside's favorite tragedy. After leaning her head against the steering wheel of her parked car and letting out a deep sigh, Diane Matheson turned her vehicle off and stepped out into the brisk morning air, her weathered brown shoes sloshing in the muddy driveway as rain drizzled down from an overcast sky. Every so often, the rumble of thunder would echo from beyond the distant mountains, or a gust of wind would blow through her long, light brown hair, but that was about as intense as the storm ever got. Diane wore a simple gray jacket and faded blue jeans. Her aging skin was pale from hardly ever leaving her house, and her brown eyes were dull and tired from decades of sorrow. She approached the dark house in front of her, glancing at a familiar red and white sign, one that hung from a single-arm post that stood next to an opening in the brick wall surrounding the yard. For sale. Please contact Kate Milens at 555-7273.
She didn't even mark it as sold.
Diane muttered, shifting her gaze back to the house in front of her. The house that Kate had sold her with the help of Lauren Jones, the realtor who'd gone missing along with Caitlin herself. She felt bad for the two of them, but after all she'd been through, all that the world had forced her to endure, Diane no longer had it in her to care about something as common as missing people in the town of Oakside. If she'd been able to move into her house before all of this happened, if she hadn't been personally inconvenienced by the fact that those two had gone missing, she wouldn't have given them a second thought. Her lack of concern wasn't a result of anger or selfishness, for it was born from a sense of apathy that had been festering within her ever since she'd lost her son. In a world that had taken everything from her, a world that felt as cold and gray as the clouds overhead, apathy was all she felt anymore. She was a hollow shell of the woman she'd once been, and she often wondered why she'd bothered keeping herself alive, why she hadn't simply given in to despair like so many others would have. Her life had been nothing but misery ever since she'd lost Charlie, and now was no exception. She'd already moved out of her old, much smaller house, uprooting what little she had left in order to move further out into the country and spend the rest of her days in solitude, almost eager to be surrounded by nature and nothing more. Diane had been right on schedule. She'd played her part properly, gotten all of her affairs in order, paid all of her bills, and yet here she was, living in a motel after the world had thrown her yet another curveball. The majority of her possessions still packed away in moving vans.
What did I do to deserve this?
She wondered, glaring at the police tape that surrounded the yard, warning her to stay away from the crime scene. As soon as she asked the question, an answer popped into her head, just as it had countless times before. If there was one thing that she could still feel, it was guilt. Guilt from being too oblivious to notice her son wandering away from his parents the day that they had lost him. Guilt from still not knowing what had really happened to him. From letting the trauma of miscarrying her would-be second child utterly ruin her marriage after she and Charles had tried so hard to make everything work. To give parenthood a second try after losing Charlie. Even after that, she'd still tried to hold out with her now-deceased ex-husband. But then, the day had come when Charles's mind began to fail him. When he'd started claiming that their son had finally returned to them, lingering around their house like some kind of horrible wraith that was trapped in the living world. Diane wasn't sure which had been worse, that or his claims that he could see Mr. Slim, Charlie's old imaginary friend, watching him from the woods. After all she'd been forced to live through, Diane couldn't bear to watch Charles descend into madness. And so she left him in his time of need, to spare herself the pain of losing someone else. She hadn't divorced him out of anger or contempt, but out of pain and hopelessness. That was why she'd kept his last name. Not long after, the house fire had claimed Charles's life, and that had been the final straw for her. After the funeral, she left the town of Oakside and hadn't looked back for many years. Diane blamed herself for the death of her ex-husband. She knew that things would have turned out differently if she'd tried to help him, if she hadn't abandoned him, but instead she'd been a coward, and there wasn't a doubt in her mind that her decision had played a part in his death, that the house fire had been more than a tragic accident. That knowledge and the guilt that came with it was something that she had to live with every day, and even now, after so many years, she hadn't forgiven herself for leaving him behind. Deep down in some half-forgotten corner of her heart, she still loved him, and it was for that reason that his death weighed her down just as much as the loss of her son. She wasn't sure why she'd returned to the town responsible for her worst memories. Perhaps it was the desire to confront her tragic past. Perhaps some small part of her still wanted to make amends for what she could. Or maybe there was just something about Oakside that would always be part of her. She'd grown up there, after all, and even though the burned shell of her old house wasn't all that far away, she was still able to muster a little bit of excitement at the thought of finally moving into her new home. As far as that matter went, this was her third attempt at entering the house. Her house. Since those two women had gone missing. The place was under lockdown due to an ongoing investigation. She'd been turned away by police the last 2 times she'd been there, but this time there was nobody around to stop her. And Diane was fed up with the world going out of its way to ruin her life.
I should at least get to see my house,
she said, stepping over the police tape. She made her way to the front door, unlocking it with the house key she'd already been given, and entering the building. Her first indication that her day was about to get even worse was that the lights wouldn't turn on no matter how many times she flipped the switch.
Great. I get to deal with repair bills right off the bat,
she grumbled, walking back out to her car and retrieving a small flashlight from her glove box. It had been sitting in her car for months and didn't have much battery left, but it would suit her needs well enough. She walked back up to the front door, flicked the flashlight on, and began to explore the ransacked building. Furniture was overturned, eerie drawings covered the wall by the stairs, the floor was cluttered with junk, and nothing electrical was working, including the heat and the water. Aside from the dim sunlight that shone through the windows and the sound of light rain hitting the roof, the house was dark and eerily silent. It hadn't changed much in the days since Lauren had first found it in disarray, with the most noticeable difference being the mud that the police, and now Diane too, had tracked in from outside. Other than that, it had remained mostly untouched, with only a few things having been moved around to make way for investigators. The whole place gave off a feeling of desolation, something that the town of Oakside was no stranger to. After walking around for a few minutes and assessing the damage, Diane felt a chill run down her spine while she was standing in the kitchen, for an unnerving sound had began to trickle out of the small room across the hall from the garage.
Is that a radio?
She wondered, listening to the muffled white noise that was coming from behind the partially closed door. Diane was correct in her assumption, but she wasn't about to go investigating to verify it. The longer she listened, the louder the sounds became, and it was when the radio began to emit strange frequencies and what sounded like backwards talking that she went from creeped out to afraid. It was only a few seconds later when she saw something that made her blood run cold, and she ran back to the front door and out of the house. Perhaps her eyes had just been playing tricks on her in the dark, but she could have swore that she'd seen the half-open door start to move.
What the hell was that?
She stammered, racing over to her car and hopping in, futilely turning her keys in the ignition as the vehicle refused to start.
Come on. Come on.
Diane muttered, but no matter how hard she tried, the engine continued to resist her efforts.
Useless piece of junk.
She cursed, glancing back at the house as her nerves threatened to get the better of her. Genuine fear was something that she hadn't felt in a very long time, and she could say with absolute honesty that she hadn't missed it. With no other options, she stepped out of her car and slammed the door, beginning to make her way up the muddy driveway as cold rain soaked into her clothes. She was taking out her phone to call for help when something froze her in her tracks, something that was stuck to a nearby tree. Missing. Have you seen this child? Charlie Matheson Jr. If you have seen this child, please contact 555-3799. Despite her predicament, Diane felt her eyes beginning to water as she stared at the poster that she and Charles had made so long ago. It was yellow and tattered with age, and she had no idea how or why it was still there, as Charlie had been presumed dead for decades. It was as she approached the poster, staring at the picture of her son's happy little face at the center of it, that her tears began to flow. She hadn't been expecting to see her lost child that day, even if it was just an old picture. And the shock of suddenly seeing his face again was the reason she had so easily forgotten the potential danger she was in. It was also the reason that she hadn't realized that the poster hadn't been there the first time that she'd come down the driveway. Why she didn't notice the temperature dropping, or the ringing in her ears as she reached out to take it off the tree's bark. As soon as her fingers made contact with the snare, 8 spidery limbs erupted from the tree, seizing Diane and dragging her and the poster inside of the trunk before she could do so much as scream. Other than the rain, the woods were silent, and there was no trace of Diane or the carefully placed lure that had sealed her fate.
I'm lost. Can you find me?
The disembodied, childlike voice sounded vaguely familiar and sent terror coursing through Diane's veins as she clambered up onto her feet, taking raspy, fearful breaths as her eyes adjusted to the near impenetrable darkness.
What just happened? Where am I?
She whimpered, her eyes filled with terror. The last thing she remembered was reaching for the poster before her vision had been overcome with darkness, and she felt a forceful rushing sensation before opening her eyes to her current whereabouts. She was empty-handed, her flashlight, her phone, and the poster having been inexplicably stripped away from her, leaving her with only the clothes on her back. After taking a few shaky breaths and a moment to get her bearings, Diane realized that she'd found herself back in the front yard of her new house. But something was horribly wrong. Everything was engulfed in a darkness so oppressive that she could barely even see the outline of the brick wall surrounding the yard. She could just make out the nearby swing set and the grass beneath her shoes. But she could no longer see her car parked in the driveway behind her, if it was even there anymore. And if not for the dim yellow light escaping the house's windows, she wouldn't have been able to see the building at all. Although the sky wasn't visible either, there was one thing that she could still make out, and that was the unmistakable glow of the radio tower far in the distance. But even that felt corrupted and threatening, as if the light itself was a malevolent force. The longer she looked at it, the more it seemed like the crimson gleam was spreading, slowly beginning to overtake the pitch-black sky with the smoky red haze. There was no wind, no rain, and no sound, other than what sounded like a dull droning tune that permeated the stale air, accompanied by an unnerving frequency that sporadically changed its pitch. Diane had no way of knowing it, but she'd been dragged down to the crawl space. She could see her breath in the freezing cold air of the abyss, and her rain-soaked clothes clung to her skin, making her body shake like a leaf.
This can't be real. It's not possible.
She whispered, trembling as she desperately tried to make sense of her situation. But she had no answers, no ideas, no clues other than the haunting drone that bore into her skull. Suddenly, the front door of the house opened, and a beam of brilliant golden light escaped from the building's depths, just bright enough to cut through the darkness a few feet in front of it. The joyful giggle of a small child echoed from somewhere inside, making Diane's heart skip a beat. That was a laugh she knew well, a laugh that she could still hear in her head if she focused hard enough. And it was in that moment that she understood why the voice that she'd heard had sounded so familiar, for it was a voice that she'd all but forgotten.
Charlie, is that you, sweetheart?
She called out, receiving another giggle in response as the silhouette of a child walked past the door.
Charlie!
She shouted, throwing caution to the wind and rushing towards the house, disregarding everything other than the possibility of seeing her son again.
Charlie, it's Mommy. I'm gonna bring you home.
She called out as she stepped through the door, which immediately slammed shut behind her. She yelped in surprise and whipped around, attempting to turn the doorknob, but it was locked. Fear once again swept over her as she turned to face the staircase, dimly aware that the house was no longer dark and eerie like before, but well lit and warm. Other than that, it hadn't changed, which she was grateful for after encountering the alien, all-encompassing void outside. Some semblance of rational thought returned to her as she considered how foolish it had been to rush headlong into potential danger, but she didn't have the luxury of hesitation. She had no time to question what was happening, to assess the situation, to worry about her own safety or the inexplicable nature of her predicament. All she knew was that her child had been gone since 1996, and now that he'd returned to her, she was never going to lose him again.
Charlie? Are you there?
Another giggle rang out from deeper in the house, this time sounding like it was coming from the room to her left. Diane rushed over to the door and pulled it open, only to be met with an intense wave of nausea as she attempted to step through it. Her head was spinning, her ears were ringing, and when she finally came to her senses after only half of a second, she realized that she wasn't in the room she'd been trying to enter, but in the bathroom by the garage.
What the hell?
She whispered in terrified confusion, still dizzy from her sudden relocation. She opened the bathroom door and stepped through it, only to be warped across the house yet again, this time to a small guest room on the second floor. With her heart pounding in her chest, Diane started throwing doors open in a blind panic, bolting through them without rhyme or reason, in a desperate attempt to escape whatever trap she'd walked into. It was clear to her now that it had indeed been a trap, for the sound of Charlie's laughter had gone silent long ago. And no matter how many times she called out to him, the only response she got was the echo of her own frantic footsteps, the sound of her heavy breathing, and the haunting ambience of the crawlspace. Then, just as she was about to collapse from exhaustion, she charged through another doorway and found herself standing in the master bedroom on the second floor. She'd been running for what felt like hours and wanted to sit down and catch her breath, but she knew that doing so would be a terrible idea. Staggering over to the door to the hallway, she attempted to turn the knob, but to her horror it wouldn't budge, trapping her inside the master bedroom. Growing more terrified by the second, she tried the door that led to the adjacent bathroom, but that too was locked. It was then that she felt an unnatural sense of dread fill her heart, and as the lights in the room began to dim, she slowly turned around to see an ominous, vaguely humanoid shadow rising from behind the bed. Diane screamed in horror and backed as far away from the shadow as she could before it suddenly expanded and quickly engulfed the entire room, leaving her momentarily suspended in pitch-black nothingness before she found herself standing in the front yard again.
I like you. I want to play a game.
Charlie's voice sounded different this time. It was distorted, corrupted almost, but it still sounded like her son. However, Diane had come to realize that the voice had never been her child, that something else was speaking to her, something malevolent. There was another problem too, and that was the fact that the red aura surrounding the radio tower had spread much further, its prongs of hazy red light steadily creeping across the black sky like tendrils.
Oh my god.
She whispered, gazing at the atmospheric disruption in a mixture of awe and fear. Whatever was going on with that tower, she wanted nothing to do with it.
The poster.
She muttered in a moment of realization, turning to face the driveway behind her. She sprinted away from the house, intending to reach the missing poster and escape from whatever nightmare she'd been transported to the same way she'd gotten there. However, as soon as she stepped beyond the gap in the brick wall, she was warped right back to her previous position in the front yard. And it wasn't lost on her that the red glow in the sky had become even more intense.
Somebody help me! Please! Is anyone out there?
She screamed into the void.
I only need you.
The demon taunted in response.
Stop using his voice!
Diane screamed. She didn't know how this entity knew what Charlie's voice sounded like or why it was using him to torment her, but she couldn't take it anymore. She attempted to get to the poster once again, only to be met with the same results.
Let me out of here, you son of a bitch! You don't need me. Go torture somebody else.
I like it this way.
Why are you doing this?
She shouted back at it, on the verge of tears. In one last-ditch attempt to escape, she ran into the backyard to look for the wooden gate, struggling to see anything through the darkness. Staying close to the brick wall to keep from getting lost, she finally located the wide-open gate and saw that it was swiftly closing itself. Diane sprinted towards it and managed to slip through just before the gate slammed shut. But before she could let her hopes rise, she realized that it had been yet another trick, for she found herself standing just outside of the house's front door, which was still closed from the last time she'd been inside.
Show yourself, you bastard. Where are you?
I'm alone.
With those words, the front door swung open once more, an invitation to face the beast that was speaking to her. The last thing Diane wanted was to go back in that house after what had happened before, but she was out of options. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and not even the darkness of the void could offer her protection anymore. For the sky was now completely red, and the fiery haze had illuminated the entire yard in a natural crimson light, so that she was completely visible to anything that might be lurking nearby. Taking a deep breath, she took a shaky step into the house, and then another, going forward until she was far enough inside that the door was able to slam shut behind her yet again, letting out an audible click as it locked itself.
I will find you instead.
Mere seconds after she processed those terrible words, Diane's blood ran cold as ghastly sounds started ringing out from deeper within the house, sounding like deep, raspy breathing, accompanied by low growls and the occasional shriek of something inhuman. It seemed to come from all around her, and there weren't any footsteps to help pinpoint the source of the noise. But she wasn't just going to sit there and wait for whatever was making them to find her. She rushed up the stairs and hid in the guest bedroom, quietly shutting and locking the door behind her and leaning against it to stop whatever was out there from getting to her. She slumped to the ground and covered her ears, trembling as she desperately tried to block out the horrible noises that were droning out of her very thoughts. They slowly grew louder and louder until it sounded like whatever was making them was right on top of her. And it was then that another noise joined the fray. A spine-chilling clicking sound with a deep pitch that could only be described as something between trees groaning in the wind and the rattling of bones. Diane's entire body was trembling. She could barely control her breathing, and no matter how hard she tried to stay silent, soft whimpering still escaped her lips. She wouldn't have been surprised if the entity on the other side of the door could actually feel her quaking in fear. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, all of the noises stopped. Even the strange ambience of the crossface was gone. She closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh of relief, foolishly believing that she was in the clear. And it was then that she felt the temperature drop like a stone as a dark presence manifested in the room with her.
Hello, Diane.
A deep, demonic voice greeted her, sending a wave of agony shooting through her head as if it was broadcasting itself directly into her brain. She opened her eyes and stared up at the suited, faceless monstrosity standing in front of her, unable to move, think, or even breathe. With only one look, Diane recognized the creature that she'd once thought of as her son's imaginary friend, the monster who'd driven her husband to madness, the demon that was undoubtedly responsible for Charlie's disappearance.
Mr. Slim,
she whispered, paralyzed with fear.
It seems that you found me, or rather...
The beast began, momentarily changing its voice to mimic her son once again.
I found you.
Furious red lights burst through the windows as the house tore itself to shreds around her, rapidly ascending into the abyssal sky in millions of tiny pieces until she found herself kneeling in the dirt where the house had once been. The hazy red glow had engulfed everything, and she could feel the temperature rising rapidly as black tendrils erupted from the ground and wrapped around her arms and legs, holding her in place as the suited demon looked down on her.
To think that all it took to lure you down here was a distant memory.
The demon said, holding Charlie's tattered poster up for her to see before letting it crumble to dust in its pale skeletal hand. Diane could no longer think straight, no longer comprehend what was happening. All she could do was grit her teeth in pain as the demon's influence slowly destroyed her mind and body. Tears streaming down her face as the temperature of the crawl space rose well beyond that of a furnace. The burning red haze glowing brighter than ever before.
All of that pain, all of that suffering, all that you've been through has led to this moment. Do you know why, Diane? Do you know what it was for?
The demon asked, leaning in close as her reddening flesh began to smoke and blister.
It was for nothing.
Diane screamed in agony as her body burst into flames. Locked in place and staring up at the sky as she slowly burned to death, all while the monstrosity in front of her stood up straight, folded its arms behind its back, and continued to gloat.
I took your child from you, your husband. Life that you could have had, it is all gone, dead, and now you too are dead.
The administrator watched silently as Diane's screams slowly faded into silence, and the woman's body burned away until there was nothing left but bones and ash. Wordlessly, he held out a pale hand, and an ethereal silver mist rose from the scorched remains and curled around his skeletal fingers. Truthfully, the torture and death of Diane Matheson had been little more than a therapeutic way for the demon to express its anger at having been cheated out of yet another prize. Not to mention a method of punishing Charlie for his betrayal, which the demon now knew all about. Regardless, a soul was a soul, and there would always be a need for more of those. The administrator stood still as the crawl space warped and shifted around him, taking on the form of a massive home library. One that was fully furnished, well lit, and by all means cozy. The room had no windows, nor did it have a ceiling, for the library's walls rose up to meet the endless void and vanished into its depths, which for once was full of silver specks of light. Some swirled around and churned in the inky black abyss. Some were frozen in place, and all of them were suspended in a perpetual purgatory, far above the comfortable study below. Old-fashioned bookshelves lined the cobblestone walls of the library, all of them filled to the brim with ancient tomes, containing forbidden knowledge from countless sources. The kind of books that only a being of the administrator's status could read without being driven to insanity. The closer the bookshelves got to the light-speckled abyss above, the less they were impacted by gravity, for hundreds of books floated high above the ground, organizing and rearranging themselves while floating from shelf to shelf, as if they had minds of their own, which, of course, some of them did. Back down on the ground, gray carpet covered the floor, and at the northern end of the room was a fancy leather armchair that stood facing a granite fireplace. The warm, crackling flames within never went out, although their colors would sometimes shift to deep crimson, pitch black, or intense violet. On the opposite end of the study was a pair of rustic double doors made from mahogany, and the rest of the room was decorated with various other furnishings, such as an antique desk that was overflowing with neatly stacked books and scrolls, a collection of potted plants from various dimensions, and medieval sconces that lined the walls between the bookshelves and never stopped burning. Most victims of the demon would never have guessed their tormentor enjoyed such luxuries, that the beast was capable of finding pleasure in things other than death and darkness. But the administrator was far more than a mere boogeyman. He was something ancient, something sophisticated, and most importantly, something to fear. As the beast strolled over to his armchair and took a seat, he sensed the tortured soul's anguish as it curled around his fingers, felt the raw emotion emanating from the wispy silver mist that had once been Diane Matheson. She was no longer capable of communication through words or gestures, but as the administrator held up his hand and gazed at the restless spirit, he knew what she was asking of him.
Please. And that.
My dear, death is only the beginning.
With that, he lifted his hand and let Diane's soul drift up into the darkness far above, where it joined the thousands of others that the administrator had claimed over the course of its many years. He had a reason for sealing them away, a plan that hadn't yet played out. So for now, they would do just fine as simple decorations, trapped in limbo until their jailer finally had a use for them. So many lives, so many souls, so many shattered dreams, fractured minds, and broken hearts, all of them doomed to spend their endless days lighting up the all-encompassing abyss, like stars in the night sky. It was hard to say which fate was worse, This, or the endless suffering that the administrator's servants were subjected to. The demon often found himself gazing up at those very souls, or gazing into the flames of his fireplace, for even a being of his stature had much to ponder. Suddenly, a knocking came from the other side of the double doors.
Come in.
The demon responded. The door swung open and the observer entered the library. Still wreathed in shadow, but lacking his signature grin. A look of nervousness on his face.
Still no sign of Miss Jones or Firebrand.
No, my keeper.
The observer responded after a few moments of hesitation.
Firebrand has proven very effective at covering his tracks. He even took that camera and suicide note off of Carl Ross's corpse. As if that makes any difference.
I expected as much. Perhaps this is my fault for not taking matters more seriously, for giving that wretch the opportunity to interfere with my plans. But it matters not. Lauren was not our only option.
The administrator mused, much to the observer's horror, who was visibly shaken from what he'd just heard.
Keeper, you don't mean...
The glasses-wearing wraith stuttered.
Indeed I do. We have played these childish games for long enough.
With all due respect, I'm not sure if...
The observer began to say, but was abruptly cut off.
Do not challenge me, observer!
The administrator roared, tentacles erupting from his back and writhing in the air as he rose from his chair and turned to face the parasitic entity, who shrunk away from his enslaver in terror.
By my hand you are given life, and by my hand it will be taken away if you continue to challenge my decisions. Is that understood?
Yes, of course. Please forgive me, Keeper. I meant no offense.
The observer whimpered, kneeling before his master and trembling with fear. There were so many things that he wanted to say to the demon, so much rage and hatred that he wished to unload on the faceless monster that he despised so much. But in such close proximity to the beast, he couldn't even allow himself to think of such things, for not even his thoughts were safe from it.
Good. Now, gather the collective and prepare for what comes next. Do not fail me again.
Yes, Keeper. I'll see it done.
The observer stammered, scurrying out of the door and letting it shut behind him. The administrator retracted its tentacles and let out a sigh, strolling back over to the fireplace and gazing into the bright orange flames as it plotted its next move.
Firebrand,
the demon snarled, an unrivaled hatred burning deep within it.
You will be made to suffer.
Thank you for listening to Blood and Venom, written by Arthur Faraday, distributed on Archive of Our Own. Season 2 of FanScape has been funded by the Nevada Arts Council and the National Endowment of the Arts. Starring Cathryn Archer as Kate Milens, Aubrey Lima as Lauren Jones and young Charlie, Chris Maconaughey as the Slender Man, Xander Grant as Carl Ross, David Klein II as the narrator. Guest starring Harlan Guthrie as the introduction narrator, Jamie Evans as Russell Parker, Jamie Petronas as Firebrand, Sean Pellington as the motel assistant, Vincent C. Davis as the observer, Fogcast as Jack Bennett, featuring performances by Amissit as Maggie Matheson, Little Trout as Francisca, Chris Cavanaugh as older Charlie Matheson, Frederick S. Gregory as Mark O'Donnell, Kylie Lee as younger Diane Matheson, Liam Delane as Habit, Amanda Vance as older Diane Matheson, Maddie James as Aaron Carter, Max Marshall as Charles Matheson, Nancy O'Fallon as Frida Matheson, Rory Booth as Rose Matheson, Susan Robb as Debbie, Christian Thornton as Cole Davis, Annabelle Duncan as Spirit 1, Troy Cram as Spirit 2, Migle Kouj Marashkite as Spirit 3, Khalid Canales King as Spirit 4, David John as Spirit 5. The chaser sound effects were performed by Annabelle Duncan, Cathryn Archer, and David Klein II. The ghoul sound effects were performed by Aubrey Lima, Chris Cavanaugh, and David Klein II. Intro and credits music created by Dylan Griggs. This series includes the following music and audio content: Revolt by World Beyond, Meteor Shower by Better Than the Book, Could Have Changed by Adrian Hopt, Oh Willow Whaley, covered by Lauren Paley, Season 2, Episode 15 of The Morbid Forest, directing and sound design by David Klein II. Special thanks to our fellow podcasting friends who have helped make Season 2 possible at Malevolent, Through the Fog, The Impala Films, creators of Haunted and audio drama Woe Begone, The Morbid Forest, and our friends at World Beyond and Jabun Audio. Thank you for joining us for this season of FanScape. We hope you enjoyed all the effort we put into this show and look forward to releasing more content for you soon.